Fine, let's start. Number 1. Zana, the Almasty wild woman of Abkhazia. Deep in the forested valleys of Abkhazia, in the western Caucasus, villagers in the middle of the 19th century told a story they swore was no story at all. They spoke of a wild woman they called Zana. She was, they said, captured in the woods near the village of Tikhina sometime in the 1850s or 60s. She was tall and enormously strong. Her skin was dark. Her face was broad and heavy-jawed. Her body, by every account, was covered in thick, reddish-black hair. To the people of the region, she was an Almasty, the wild hominin of Caucasus folklore, the local cousin of the Yeti and the wild man. A nobleman named Eji Ganaba is said to have taken possession of her. At first she was kept confined behind a fence, fed through the bars, too dangerous to approach. Over years, the accounts say, she grew calmer and could do simple tasks. And here the legend takes a turn that no folktale about a monster usually takes. Zana bore children. The fathers were local village men. Some of her infants died, but several survived and grew up as ordinary people, marrying and having children of their own. Zana herself is said to have died around 1890. For a long time, that was all there was. Testimony, gathered decades later. The Soviet zoologist Alexander Mashkovtsev went looking in the 1960s and collected what the elderly villagers still remembered. The historian Boris Porshnev took it further, arguing that Zana might be a surviving Neanderthal, a relic of the deep past hiding in the mountains. The researcher Igor Bortsev mounted expeditions and recovered the skull of one of Zana's sons, a man named Quit, who had died in 1954. The skull looked robust, unusual, suggestive. Then the question moved from anecdote to laboratory. The Oxford geneticist Brian Sykes took up the case for a documentary in 2013. He collected saliva samples from Zana's living descendants across the region. He obtained DNA tied to Quit's remains, and the result was not a relict hominin at all. The mitochondrial DNA pointed to sub-Saharan African ancestry. There was no archaic signal, no Neanderthal, no unknown species. Sykes concluded that Zana had been an anatomically modern human woman, almost certainly of African descent, who had somehow ended up isolated and captive in the Caucasus. Her difference and her suffering hardened over time into the legend of a beast. He laid the case out in his 2015 book on the search for hidden hominins. The detail that makes the story so persuasive is the descendants themselves. Sykes did not work from a single relic. He sampled multiple living people who descend from Zana, and the African mitochondrial signature ran consistently through the line, exactly as it should if their ancestor were an African woman rather than a wild beast of the woods. The robust skull of her son Quit, once read as evidence of something archaic, fits comfortably within the range of modern human variation. Critics still pointed out the limits: a small number of samples, an imperfect chain of custody for century-old bones, and the difficulty of proving which grave belongs to whom after so long. The fringe still holds that the Almasty is real and unproven, but the mainstream reading is quietly devastating. The monster of the forest was a person, and if a wild woman of the mountains turns out to be a real human being, you have to wonder how many other monsters are simply people we failed to recognize. Number 2. The Pedro Mountain Mummy and the Little People. In October of 1932, two gold prospectors named Cecil Main and Frank Carr were blasting rock in the Pedro Mountains, about 60 miles southwest of Casper, Wyoming. When the dust cleared, they found a small sealed cavity in the granite. Inside sat a tiny mummified figure, knees drawn up to its chest, arms crossed. Seated, it stood barely 14 inches tall. Upright, it might have reached 65 centimeters. Its skin was dark and deeply wrinkled, the top of its head oddly flattened, the eyes heavy and half-closed. To the people who knew the region's oral traditions, this was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. The Shoshone and the Arapaho told of a race of little people who lived in the mountains and the Badlands. The Shoshone called one such group the Nemerigar, small and fierce, said to defend themselves with tiny poisoned arrows. Here, it seemed, was one of them, dried and preserved in the rock. Skeptics cried hoax. It looked like a sideshow curio, the kind of thing sold to traveling carnivals. So the mummy was X-rayed. The radiographs settled one question immediately. This was no carved doll. Inside was a complete skeleton with a spine, ribs, and a damaged skull. Scientists at the American Museum of Natural History and at Harvard looked at the images, and some judged it a genuine, mummified body of real age. The modern investigator who did the most to explain it was Dr. George Gill, a physical anthropologist at the University of Wyoming. His conclusion was sobering. The most likely identity of the Pedro mountain mummy was an infant, or even a fetus, afflicted with anencephaly, a fatal birth defect in which the top of the skull and much of the brain fail to form. Anencephaly can leave a flattened, open-topped cranium and give a newborn strangely adult-looking facial proportions. A tiny body that looks like a wizened old man is exactly what the condition can produce. The anatomy fits this reading in detail. The flattened crown, the sunken features, the strange proportions that made the figure look like a tiny ancient man are all consistent with a newborn whose skull never fully closed. A second, similar miniature mummy, nicknamed Chiquita, was later subjected to DNA testing. The genetic result indicated Native American ancestry, consistent with a local indigenous infant, not an unknown species. The laboratory and the bones agreed. These were the remains of real children, born with a devastating defect, in communities that already carried a tradition of little people. The original Pedro mountain mummy, however, was sold, passed from owner to owner, and eventually vanished. No one knows where it is today. That loss matters because it means the one specimen at the heart of the legend can never be sequenced with modern tools. What we are left with is a powerful pattern. Real human infants, a real birth defect, and a folklore that wrapped them in legend. And once again, the explanation does not diminish the people. It returns them to us, which raises the next question. What happens when the strange trait is not lethal at all, but something you can simply see on a person's skin? Number 3, the Blue People of Kentucky. In the isolated hollows along Troublesome Creek in eastern Kentucky, there really were blue people. Not bruised, not cold, not painted. Blue. Their skin carried a deep indigo or plum tint from the moment they were born, and the color stayed with them for life. For generations, rumors of the Blue Mountain folk circulated through Appalachia, and for generations, they were exactly true. The line traces back to a French orphan named Martin Fugate, who settled near Troublesome Creek around 1820, and his wife, Elizabeth Smith. By a remarkable coincidence, both of them appear to have carried the same rare recessive gene. In an isolated community where families intermarried over the decades, that recessive trait surfaced again and again. The cause is a condition called hereditary methemoglobinemia. Normally, your blood carries oxygen on a protein called hemoglobin. In these family members, an unusual amount of their hemoglobin existed in a form called methemoglobin, which is darker in color and cannot release oxygen to the tissues properly. Enough methemoglobin in the blood tints the skin blue, even when the person is otherwise healthy. The underlying problem was a deficiency of an enzyme, cytochrome B5 reductase, whose job is to convert methemoglobin back into normal hemoglobin. The gene responsible sits on chromosome 22. The man who solved it in person was Dr. Madison Coween III, a hematologist at the University of Kentucky. In the 1960s, he tracked the family into the hills, working alongside a nurse named Ruth Pendergrass. Coween identified the enzyme deficiency, and then he did something almost theatrical. He treated affected family members with methylene blue, a dye that acts as an electron donor and pushes the chemistry back toward normal hemoglobin. Within minutes of an injection, blue skin turned pink, a lifelong color reversed in front of his eyes. One of the last famously blue fugates was a boy named Benji Stacy, born in 1975, who arrived so deeply blue that doctors prepared for an emergency. His color faded as he grew. Over the 20th century, new roads, more mobility, and a widening gene pool diluted the trait until it largely disappeared. What looks like a legend, a hidden tribe of blue mountain people, is in reality a clean lesson in genetics, a founder effect, a recessive gene, and the slow mathematics of an isolated population. The blue blood was real, and it was written in a single enzyme. But not every legend built on a real condition is so gentle. Some of them are about the dead refusing to stay dead. Number 4. The New England Vampire. In 1990, children sledding down a gravel hillside in Griswold, Connecticut, dislodged something that did not belong on a sled run. Skulls. The discovery triggered an emergency excavation led by the Connecticut state archaeologist, Nicholas Bellantoni. What he uncovered was an unmarked colonial-era burial ground belonging to the Walton family. Most of the graves were ordinary. One was not. In that one grave, the body had been dug up years after burial and deliberately rearranged. The skull had been removed and set on top of the ribcage, with the two thigh bones crossed beneath it, forming a skull and crossbones. On the decayed coffin lid, brass tacks spelled out the characters JB55. The reading was that these were the man's initials and his age at death. He had been a man of about 50 to 55, tall for his time, his bones marked by a life of hard physical labor. His ribs told the crucial part of the story. They carried lesions consistent with chronic pulmonary tuberculosis, the wasting lung disease that earlier centuries called consumption. And that single detail unlocks the whole grim ritual. In the New England vampire panics of the 17 and 1800s, families watched relatives waste away one after another, coughing, pale, fading. With no understanding of bacteria, they concluded that the recently dead were rising to feed on the living. The remedy was to exhume the suspected vampire and rearrange or destroy the remains, especially the heart, to stop the predation. JB55 had been treated exactly this way. His grave reopened roughly 5 years after his death. For decades, he was anonymous. Then, in 2019, the United States Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory analyzed the badly degraded DNA from his bones. They recovered a Y chromosome profile, the genetic signature passed from father to son, and combined it with historical genealogical records. The trail pointed to a surname, Barber. The man was most likely John Barber, a local farmer. A nearby smaller grave, marked NB13, is thought to hold a related child, possibly Nathan Barber. So the New England vampire was a tuberculosis victim, and the disease that spread through his household was the real thing feeding on the living. The case is a model of how forensic osteology, ancient DNA, and genealogy can work together to put a name to a folklore monster. The vampire had a face, and a family, and a cause of death we can spell out. Now consider a legend even older and more widespread, where the monster is not the dead, but a man covered in hair. Number 5. Werewolves and the Wolfman gene. Across Europe for centuries, people told of werewolves and wild men of the forest, humans whose bodies were covered head to toe in animal-like hair. Strip away the shape-shifting and the full moon, and you are left with something medically real, a condition called congenital hypertrichosis, an abnormal, heritable growth of hair across the entire body and face. In its most striking form, hypertrichosis lanuginosa, a person is covered in soft, fine, fetal-type hair. It is extraordinarily rare. Only a few dozen severe cases are well documented in all of recorded history. The most famous of them has a name and a date. Petrus Gonçalves was born in 1537 on the island of Tenerife in the Canaries, his face and body covered in hair. As a boy, he was shipped to the court of King Henry II of France, where he was treated as a living curiosity, the man of the woods. But Gonçalves was no beast. He was educated, he married a French woman named Catherine, and he had children, several of whom inherited the same hair. Court artists painted the family, and their portraits traveled across Renaissance Europe. Many scholars believe the Gonçalves story helped inspire the tale of Beauty and the Beast. Modern genetics has shown that hypertrichosis is not one condition, but several, with different causes, some carried on the X chromosome and some on other chromosomes. In 1995, the geneticist Luis Figuera and his colleagues studied a large Mexican family affected by X-linked congenital hypertrichosis. They traced the trait to a region on the long arm of the X chromosome, the stretch labeled XQ24 to Q27. Later research connected some X-linked cases to rearrangements of the DNA near a gene called SOX3. A different form, Ambrus syndrome, has been linked to changes on chromosome 8. Because the X-linked forms follow a distinctive inheritance pattern, they move through families in a way that can make the trait seem to appear and reappear almost supernaturally, which is precisely the kind of pattern that breeds legend. A condition that surfaces in one generation, skips the next, and returns in a grandchild looks, to people without genetics, like a curse passing down a bloodline. The portraits of the Gonçalves children are themselves a kind of early scientific record, capturing a heritable trait passing from parent to child centuries before anyone could name the mechanism. The so-called wolf families of Mexico, documented in the 20th century, are the real living descendants of this genetics, not victims of a curse. There is also an acquired form of excessive hair growth, driven by hormones or illness, but it differs from the inherited congenital types. Pull the thread, and the werewolf unravels into a mutation mapped to a specific stretch of a chromosome. The fear was real. The transformation never was. And from a legend about a person mistaken for an animal, we move to legends about animals mistaken for monsters. Number 6. The Siberian Unicorn. The unicorn is usually filed under pure fantasy, but there really was a one-horned giant on the Eurasian steppe, and it lived alongside human beings. Its name is Elasmotherium sibericum, the Siberian unicorn, and it was a rhinoceros built on a colossal scale. Estimates put its weight at 3.5 to 4.5 tons, in the same league as a mammoth. It stood roughly 2 meters at the shoulder and stretched about 4.5 meters long. On its skull sat a great bony dome, and most researchers interpret that dome as the base for an enormous horn made of keratin. Keratin does not fossilize, so the horn itself is gone, but the anchor it left behind suggests something genuinely huge. For a long time, the textbook story said Elasmotherium had gone extinct around 200,000 years ago, far too early to have ever been seen by modern humans. Then, the dating fell apart. In 2016, a team including the researchers Andrei Spansky and Pavel Kosintsev radiocarbon dated a skull from western Siberia to only about 29,000 years ago. 2 years later, in 2018, a major study in the journal Nature Ecology and Evolution rewrote the animal completely. Led by Kosintsev and including Adrian Lister, Kieran Mitchell, and Alan Cooper, the team dated many specimens and, crucially, recovered ancient DNA from the bones. The conclusions were startling on 2 fronts. First, the Siberian unicorn survived until at least about 39,000 years ago, which means it overlapped in time with both modern humans and Neanderthals. People could have laid eyes on the living animal. Second, the DNA revealed that Elasmotherium had split from the lineage of all living rhinoceroses around 43 million years ago. It was not a close cousin of today's rhinos at all. It was the last survivor of an ancient, deeply divergent branch of the rhino family tree, a creature that had been evolving on its own for tens of millions of years. Its downfall, the study argued, was not human hunting, but climate. Elasmotherium was a specialist, dependent on tough, dry steppe grasses, and as the late Ice Age climate shifted and that habitat shrank, the giant could not adapt. Stable isotope analysis of its teeth supports that picture of a narrow, specialized grazer. Classical writers, from Ctesias to the medieval traveler Ibn Fadlan, passed down accounts of one-horned beasts from the eastern steppe. It is entirely plausible that a real, surviving, single-horned giant helped seed the legend of the unicorn. Ancient DNA moved its extinction date by more than 150,000 years and redrew the rhino family tree in the process. Which brings us to the most famous monster of all, and the question of what was really leaving tracks in the snow. Number 7. The Yeti. High in the Himalaya, across Nepal, Tibet, and Bhutan, people have long told of a hairy man-beast in the snow, the creature the West came to call the abominable snowman. Sherpa and Tibetan traditions actually describe several kinds of wild mountain beings, and some of them are explicitly linked to bears. Western obsession took off in the 20th century, when mountaineering expeditions returned with photographs of enormous footprints pressed into high-altitude snow. In monasteries, relics were preserved and revered. Supposed Yeti scalps, a mummified hand, tufts of hair, scraps of bone. This is where DNA enters the mountains. In 2014, the Oxford geneticist Brian Sykes published a study in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B, in which he tested around 30 hair samples attributed to Yetis and other anomalous primates from around the world. 2 Himalayan samples, one from Ladakh and one from Bhutan, closely matched a genetic sequence from an ancient polar bear. Sykes floated the idea that an unknown bear, or a hybrid of brown and polar bears, might be roaming the Himalaya. In 2015, a reanalysis by Eliezer Gutierrez and Ronald Pine argued for something less exotic. The samples, they said, simply matched the living Himalayan brown bear. Then, in 2017, the biologist Charlotte Lindqvist of the University at Buffalo led the most thorough study yet, also published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B. Her team analyzed 9 separate Yeti samples gathered from museums and monasteries, including hair, bone, teeth, skin, and even feces. The results were almost comically clear. 8 of the 9 samples came from bears, specifically Asian black bears, Himalayan brown bears, and Tibetan brown bears. The 9th sample came from a dog. The team reconstructed mitochondrial genomes and, as a bonus, clarified the evolutionary history of the rare bears of the high Himalaya. The verdict is consistent across the studies. The Yeti legend is rooted in real, local bear populations. A brown bear rearing up on its hind legs in deep snow makes a tall, ambiguous, almost human silhouette. Its tracks, melting and refreezing in the sun, swell into giant footprints. Not a single tested sample produced DNA from an unknown primate. The abominable snowman dissolved into ordinary, identifiable wildlife, and the search even paid a scientific dividend by mapping the genetics of bears that genuinely need conservation. A global monster turned out to be a bear. But our final legend runs the other way. Instead of shrinking a myth into an animal, DNA proved that an entire mythic nation of warriors was real. Number 8. The Amazons. The Amazons were the warrior women of Greek myth, a nation of females who rode, hunted, and fought as the equals of men, living at the wild edges of the known world. The Greeks themselves, including the historian Herodotus, linked the Amazons to real peoples of the Eurasian steppe, the Sauromations and the Scythians. For a very long time, scholars treated the Amazons as a symbol, a fantasy, a Greek thought experiment about a world turned upside down. The archaeology of the steppe proved them wrong. Across the grasslands stretching from Ukraine into Central Asia, the Scythian and Sarmatian peoples buried their dead in great mounds called kurgans. When archaeologists opened these graves, they found women buried with weapons, armor, and horse gear. In some regions, a striking share of female burials contain arms. For years, excavators had simply assumed that any skeleton buried with a sword or a bow must be male. Modern methods, careful skeletal sexing, and ancient DNA analysis exposed the error. Many of the armed warriors were biologically female. The bones carry the proof in their own right. Some of these women show combat injuries, including bronze arrowheads embedded in their skeletons. Others have bowed leg bones, the lasting mark of a life spent on horseback. In 2019, Russian archaeologists excavating the Devitsa 5 necropolis in the Voronezh region uncovered a burial holding several women, warriors interred together. One of them wore a golden ceremonial headdress called a kalathos. Iron weapons and arrowheads lay with the female remains. The Stanford historian Adrienne Mayer gathered this kind of evidence in her 2014 book on the Amazons, making the case that the myth was grounded in fact. Genetic studies of the Scythians, including work led by Unterländer and colleagues in 2017, traced the ancestry and mobility of these steppe peoples in detail. The picture that emerges is unambiguous. Armed, horse-riding women were a genuine feature of steppe nomad society. They hunted, they raided, they defended their people, and when they died, they were buried as warriors. The Greek myth of the Amazons was not invention out of nothing. It was a distorted memory of real cultural contact with peoples whose women carried weapons. Bioarchaeology and DNA together turned a legend into documented social history. And that is the thread running through all 8 of these stories. The reason a children's tale or a campfire monster deserves a second scientific look. So why do legends keep turning out to contain something real? Part of the answer is that oral tradition is a memory system. Before writing, before archives, stories were how human communities stored what mattered, and a vivid, frightening tale survives retelling far better than a dry fact. Legends compress real events into memorable images. A wasting epidemic becomes a vampire. A man with a rare condition becomes a beast. A nation of mounted warrior women becomes a race of Amazons. The kernel is real, even when the packaging grows fantastic. There are striking cases of oral memory reaching across enormous spans of time. Some indigenous Australian traditions appear to preserve the memory of coastlines that drowned thousands of years ago, when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Researchers have matched specific story details to the geography of land that has been underwater for 7,000 or 8,000 years, which means a spoken account can, under the right conditions, survive hundreds of generations. Fear, in particular, sharpens transmission, because the stories that keep you alive are the ones you pass on. The unfamiliar gets named, and the named gets mythologized. An eyewitness encounter with something strange, a captive, a deformed body, an unknown animal, hardens over generations into a monster. Each retelling smooths the story towards something more memorable and more frightening, while the original event sinks beneath the surface of the tale. None of this means every legend hides a truth. Many are pure invention, and the real skill is telling the signal from the noise. Certain motifs recur across cultures because monsters are cognitively appealing, not because they all existed. But the pattern is strong enough that scientists increasingly treat folklore as a flawed archive worth mining, a set of leads to be tested rather than dismissed. And to test them, you need a tool that can read the truth out of old bones and older blood. That tool is ancient DNA, and it is worth understanding how it actually works. DNA begins to break down the moment an organism dies. Over centuries and millennia, it fragments into tiny pieces and accumulates chemical damage, so an ancient sample is never a clean, complete genome. It is a shredded, damaged document. The greatest enemy is contamination, because a single touch from a modern human can swamp the faint original signal. That is why this work happens in clean rooms, with strict controls, gowns, and constant testing for stray DNA. Researchers often target mitochondrial DNA first, because each cell carries many copies of it, so it survives better than the DNA in the nucleus. A typical cell holds a single nucleus, but hundreds or thousands of mitochondria, which is why that small loop of DNA is often the only thing left to read. The field only became powerful with high-throughput sequencing, which can read millions of tiny fragments at once and reassemble them against a reference. The pioneer most associated with the field is Svante Pääbo, whose work made the sequencing of Neanderthals and Denisovans possible and eventually earned a Nobel Prize. Alongside DNA, scientists use radiocarbon dating to pin down age, which is exactly how the Siberian Unicorn's true timeline was revealed, and the two methods together are far more powerful than either alone. The same toolkit appears across these legends in different forms. A Y chromosome profile, passed from father to son, helped point to a surname for the Griswold vampire. Ancestry can be read from degraded samples, as with Zana's descendants. Whole mitochondrial genomes can be reconstructed, as with the Himalayan bears, and phylogenetics can place a creature on the tree of life, as with Elasmotherium splitting from living rhinos 43 million years ago. But the method has hard limits. When a specimen is lost, like the Pedro mountain mummy, or degraded beyond recovery, even the best lab can do nothing. Confidence comes from controls, replication, and peer review, which is why the strongest cases here are the published, scrutinized ones. Look across the 8 stories, and a few clear patterns appear. The first is that some monsters are diseases. Tuberculosis sat behind the New England vampire panics. Methemoglobinemia turned the Fugates blue. Hypertrichosis lay under the werewolf. Anencephaly produced the little people mummies. In a world without germ theory or genetics, a wasting sickness, a strange color, a coat of hair, or a tiny malformed body had no natural explanation, so people reached for a supernatural one. Contagion patterns looked supernatural because they were invisible. A disease that moves through a household, killing relatives one by one, genuinely looks like something is feeding on the family. Tuberculosis was the perfect engine for a vampire panic because it spreads slowly between people in close contact and produces exactly the pallor, weight loss, and night sweats that the living attributed to a predatory corpse. Recessive genetic traits looked supernatural because they could vanish for generations and then surface, especially in isolated communities where a founder effect concentrated a rare gene. A trait carried silently by many people can suddenly appear in a child whose parents both happen to be carriers, which to earlier eyes looked like a curse striking from nowhere. Visible difference brought stigma, and stigma fed the legend. What modern science does here is a kind of retroactive autopsy. It names the condition without erasing the person. The blue skin of the Fugates resolves into a missing enzyme on chromosome 22, and methylene blue closes the loop by literally reversing the color. There is an ethical edge to this, because these were real, often suffering people, and naming their condition restores their identity rather than their monstrosity. Disease legends share a single theme with the rest, a profound misunderstanding, frozen into a story. But not every monster was a sick human. Some were simply animals seen badly. The second pattern is that some monsters are real animals. The Yeti turned out to be bears, and the unicorn turned out to be a giant Ice Age rhinoceros. Large animals seen in poor conditions, in snow, fog, or failing light, are easy to misread. A bear's tracks, distorted by melting snow, balloon into the footprints of a giant. A bear standing upright takes on a human-like outline. And early humans really did share the landscape with enormous strange creatures, the surviving megafauna of the Ice Age, any of which could feed a legend. There is a deeper version of this too, where fossils themselves become monsters. The classic proposed example is the griffin, the eagle-headed lion of the ancient world, which some scholars link to ancient people encountering the fossil skeletons of beaked, four-legged dinosaurs like Protoceratops in the deserts of Central Asia. The Cyclops of Greek myth has a similar candidate, in the skulls of dwarf elephants once common on Mediterranean islands, whose large central nasal opening can look unsettlingly like a single eye socket. Rarity breeds mythologizing. The rarer and stranger the animal or the bone, the more elaborate the story that grows around it. What makes animal legends so satisfying to investigate is that they are testable. A hair, a tooth, a fragment of bone can be sequenced, and the answer comes back as a species. The work even pays dividends beyond the legend, because mapping the genetics of Himalayan bears helps conserve animals that are genuinely rare. The unicorn's case is the most spectacular, because the DNA did not just identify the beast. It revealed that Elasmotherium was the lone survivor of a branch of the rhino family that had been evolving separately for tens of millions of years. The animal was stranger than the myth. And then there is the hardest category of all, the legends that turned out to be people. The third pattern is the most uncomfortable. Some monsters were people, mistreated and misunderstood. Zana was not a relict hominin. She was a human woman, captive and isolated, whose appearance and circumstances were rewritten as a beast. Petrus Gonsalves was not a wolfman, but an educated courtier, with a rare condition, displayed as a curiosity for the entertainment of kings. The Fugates were not a hidden tribe, but a stigmatized family carrying a recessive gene. Across history, difference has been framed as monstrosity, and the unusual have been captured, displayed, and dehumanized. Captivity and exhibition turned real people into spectacles, and spectacle turned them into legend. The courts of Europe kept people with rare conditions as curiosities, and traveling shows did the same well into modern times, each appearance hardening the line between human and monster. Isolation amplified the effect, because a community that never sees a particular kind of person has no category for them except monster. What genetics does in these cases is quietly radical. It restores humanity to the so-called monster, swapping a label for a diagnosis and a name. There is a real cost recorded in these legends, the cost paid by the human beings at their center. It is worth resisting the romance of the cryptid long enough to see that a wild woman's story may be the only surviving record of a trafficked, suffering person. The responsibility of modern science is not just to solve the puzzle, but to name the people the historical record forgot, and to turn wonder into something closer to compassion. The same thread links Zana, Gonsalves, and the Blue Children of Troublesome Creek. Each was a person first. Yet for all that DNA has settled, plenty remains genuinely open. It would be dishonest to pretend every case is closed. The Pedro Mountain mummy, the one specimen that could have given a definitive answer, was sold and lost, and may never be found. The remains tied to Zana come with a contested chain of custody, and the genetic sampling was limited. Small sample sizes carry statistical uncertainty, and degradation can defeat any attempt to recover nuclear DNA from the oldest or worst preserved material. There are legends that simply outrun the evidence. Many cryptids leave behind no testable material at all, only stories and blurry images. And where there is nothing to sequence, science has nothing to say. That silence is often misread in both directions as proof of a hoax or proof of a hidden truth, when it is really just absence. Fringe interpretations persist precisely in these gaps, because an untested story can be made to mean anything. The discipline of the science is to wait for material, rather than to fill the silence with a preferred answer. The honest path forward is more material and better material. Re-excavation, the reanalysis of museum collections, and newer methods like recovering DNA straight from cave sediments or reading ancient proteins when DNA is gone. There are ethical limits as well, especially around sampling human remains, which increasingly and rightly involves consultation with descendant and indigenous communities and questions of repatriation. The work is unfinished by design. Some of these mysteries will yield to the next generation of sequencing, and some may stay mysteries forever, which is part of why they still grip us. Step back, and a single idea ties all 8 legends together. A legend is compressed truth, a real event or person or animal, packed into a story dense enough to survive thousands of years of retelling. The reveals sort cleanly into 3 buckets. Some monsters were diseases, like the vampire and the blue people. Some were animals, like the Yeti and the unicorn. And some were people, like Zana and the wolfman, human beings turned into beasts by fear and distance. DNA is the translator. It reads the old story back into the language of fact, and in doing so, it keeps teaching us humility. We were wrong about when the unicorn died by more than 150,000 years. We were wrong to think armed warriors must be men. We were wrong, again and again, to mistake a person for a monster. Each correction restores something: a dignity, a species, a diagnosis, a name. None of this drains the wonder out of the world. If anything, the truth is stranger than the legend. A rhinoceros from a 43-million-year-old branch, a nation of warrior women under the steppe, a blue family in the Kentucky hills. Wonder and evidence can live in the same place. The pattern that keeps emerging is the most haunting part, that the monsters in our oldest stories are so often a reflection of us. And there are more legends waiting, untested, still wrapped in their stories, holding their kernels of truth until someone reads the record written in the genes.